means, first of all, how much power do you have in the workplace, and how much power do you have in society? Do you get to make decisions? Do you get to work independently? Do you get to help shape the direction of the company, or do you basically just do what you're told? Working class jobs are jobs generally that pay hourly wages, not salaries. They pay a wide range of hourly wages, but they pay hourly wages. Working class jobs tend to be jobs that have relatively little social status. Many of them, probably the majority of them, are jobs that we encounter people doing those jobs every day, and we tend to ignore them. You know, the person taking our order at McDonald's, the person cleaning the bathroom in the student union, the person taking out the trash, the person driving the bus, they're just there. And we don't think of those as jobs that we should pay attention to. And we often don't think of them as the kinds of jobs that we would ever, we don't want to do those jobs. My students tell me regularly, most of them coming from working class backgrounds, that those are the jobs they do for now. But my real job, my real career is going to be something else. And that's in part a reflection of the low status of working class jobs. Generally, and this is true, I should say, about everything I'm saying, none of this applies to every single working class person. All of it is sort of broad generalizations. Generally, working class jobs involve either physical labor or service, personal service of one kind or another, waitressing, being a manicurist, being a home health care aide, or working in a factory, being a construction worker, being a truck driver, those kinds of things generally count as working class jobs. So working class people are people who do working class jobs. Doesn't matter necessarily in that definition how much you get paid, it's the nature of the job, but there's more. How much you get paid does matter. Working class people earn the median income or less. That might vary by place. That's a rough estimate. Different pollsters and groups use different kinds of measures, but they say, look, if you're earning a certain amount or less, then you're probably working class. So that's one piece of it. Working class people generally have little accumulated wealth. They haven't earned enough in their lives to be able to do things like own a home or own multiple pieces of property. If they own a home, their home is likely their only piece of property. All of their wealth has gone into that, and they don't have a large savings account or a whole lot of stocks. Increasingly, they may or may not have pensions, so all of that comes into play here. That means that working class people are vulnerable to losing their homes. If they lose a job, if they run into serious health problems and have a lot of bills to pay, if some other big catastrophe hits, they are, one person I read talks about, working class people are 2 paychecks away from being homeless. The people who are, they may be able to support their families perfectly fine as long as the job holds. But if something big happens, they're vulnerable. So they're economically vulnerable. One of the common ways of defining class is to say that you're working class if you don't have a bachelor's degree. You have an associate's degree, you have a technical degree, that puts you in a different category in terms of education. This, by the way, is changing because more and more people who do working class jobs have bachelor's degrees. And in fact, if we look at the future of the American economy, out of 30 of the fastest growing job categories listed at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, something like 22 of them don't require a college education and are low-wage jobs. So that includes things like manicurists, home health care aides, security guards at casinos. I don't quite get that one, but that's the future of the American workplace. And what that means is no matter how many people we talk into going to college, some of them are still going to be janitors and home health care aides and preschool teachers and all kinds of things that we don't pay enough for people to really be out of the working class. On a different kind of axis, you're working class if you think you're working class. If that's an identity that is meaningful to you, then that's an identity that's meaningful for you. People of all kinds associate generally, primarily, with other people from their own social class. The same is true for the working class, and that those affiliations are especially important in working class culture because working class culture places a high value on connections with other people and on community. So those community affiliations are particularly important. Often, working class people will think of themselves and people like themselves as the real people, and everybody else, especially those who are further up the social class ladder, as people who they're not sure they can trust, they're not sure are genuine, they're not sure are actually doing anything like productive work, and are not sure are a model that they want to follow. You know, we imagine in working class, in American culture, that everyone wants to be middle class. There's plenty of working class people who would say, well, I want to make as much as a working class person, as a middle class person does, but I don't want to have to be like them. There's often a sort of cultural divide that goes with that. Another piece of culture is this concept of cultural capital that has to do with the kinds of assets and resources, sort of intangible assets and resources that people have to draw upon. So that working class people don't have the breadth of cultural capital, and they don't have the same cultural capital that middle class people have. So middle class people are much more likely to have traveled a good deal and to have had experiences where they're interacting with people who are significantly different from them in one way or another. Working class people are much more likely to have lived their lives in the same neighborhood, interacting primarily with other people like themselves. So they have less varied social experience, different kind of cultural capital. There's a strength to that, let's not forget, that having deep roots in a local community gives you a place of power to work from, but it's a different kind of capital, different kinds of resources. Working class people may reject and/or they may be intimidated by, and sometimes both of these things happen, the social practices of middle class and elite cultures. And that can range from things like, how close do you stand to somebody to have a conversation? What do you wear to a particular kind of occasion? Which fork do you pick up at that fancy dinner that has, 7 forks? How do you behave if you go to a fancy restaurant? A whole lot of sort of everyday things that if you're middle class, you take for granted. If you come from a working class family, that hasn't been part of your experience. Now, I should say that the opposite is true. China and I were talking about this earlier today, and what happens when people from middle class backgrounds go to working class homes. When I first started doing work in working class studies, among the early projects I was working on was writing a book about Youngstown. And my partner and I went to a bunch of people's houses to do interviews. And everywhere we went, every time we walked into somebody's house, they would offer us a cup of coffee and something to eat. And the first 2 times, I very politely declined, because what I had learned is that, you don't put people out that way. That's a sort of pro forma thing, that that's not really, people don't really want to feed you. It's kind of an imposition to do that. And the second time that happened and we walked out of somebody's house, John looked at me and says, always say yes. Somebody offers you food and drink, always say yes. That's a working class value that says you make that kind of connection and you do it through things like feeding people. I don't care what they're serving, always say yes. And I had to be trained to do that. I just hadn't learned that lesson along the way. So that cultural capital thing can go in both directions. We just are functioning in different cultures. There's a wonderful discussion that Jack Metzger has it in his article, and I'm pointing back here because it's in this new Working Class Studies book. A woman named Barbara Jensen, who's a clinical psychologist in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, has written about this and actually has a new book coming out, I think, within the next 6 months, about working class culture and comparing working class culture with middle class culture. The working class people have working class culture, and they talk about the difference between being and becoming. Working class people focus on being. If you're a working class person, and this used to be more true probably than it is now. If you grew up in Youngstown, Ohio in the 1960s, you went to work in the steel mill when you were 18 if you were male. And you essentially stayed there. You might move from one job to another somewhere along the line, but you were done. You were being, and you were surviving, and you were enjoying that life. And your focus in life was not on how can I move up the ladder. If you're a middle class person, the focus is entirely on moving up the ladder. It's how can I advance? It's on becoming. What are you becoming? My father displays middle class culture very well. Every time he calls me up and says, okay, you're a full professor, when are you going to be a dean? I want you to be a dean, because that's the next step up the ladder. I'm like, I don't ever want to be a dean. But from my father's perspective, as a middle class business person who worked in corporations, what you do is move up the ladder. That's becoming.